Be seated. I mentioned earlier, if only these walls could speak, who would they talk about? I just, there's not a lot of kids running around in our midst these days, but I can always imagine the pitter-patter of little feet around here, days gone by, and I'm sure there must have been some kids in the past that, let's say, gave us a little trouble. So it reminds me of the story of two little boys who were best friends at church, but they also had the strongest reputation for causing a lot of problems at church. They were always getting into trouble. And one Sunday in particular, one of the boys was homesick, and so the other boy, not wanting to let his friend down, was twice as bad as normal. And as he was running around and getting into everything around the sanctuary, knocking over things, the pastor managed to catch up with him and grab him by the collar and angrily said, "Young man, where's God?" Well, the little boy was frightened and didn't know what to say. The pastor continued, "I want you to go home and think about it, and I don't want you to come back here until you can tell me where God is." Implying that God is here, right? The boy went home. He called his sick friend on the phone and he said, "Guess what? They've lost God, and they're trying to blame that on us too." Where is God? Where is God? That's a great question to ask on a Sunday like this. This is the last Sunday we will be worshiping in this stately old sanctuary. And so we need some perspective, theological perspective. We need to be able to see the big picture because there's a lot of grieving that is occurring this morning. This feels somewhat like a funeral, a bigger crowd than normal, right? Although I would remind you that funerals in the Christian tradition are often as celebratory as they are somber. And so today we are celebrating the history of St. John in this building, even as we look forward to a new chapter in this congregation's story. But again, to do that, we need some theological perspective. We want to know, and we need to know where God is in all this. We need the assurance of God's guidance and shepherding as we prepare ourselves for our next move. The Apostle Paul was in Athens, Greece one day, standing in front of another old building, the Areopagus. The Areopagus was a very important place. It functioned as the high court of appeal for criminal and civil cases, sort of like our Supreme Court. Later it became known as Mars Hill, named after the Roman god of war. So it was a place to get some perspective. And Paul gives a nice speech to the crowd of Athenians. He tells them where God is by first telling them where God is not. He said, "The God who made the world and everything in it, He who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands." And I would add that nor does God live in buildings made by human hands. Now, Paul was not just referring to this notion that the various gods of ancient Rome lived here or there. He was also he was speaking to his own people, and responding to the view that the God of Israel was associated exclusively with the temple in Jerusalem. He was speaking to that as well. Paul was a former Pharisee and a supporter of the temple in Jerusalem in previous days, but now he has poo-pooed that perspective that he had of God years earlier. And I think this is good for us to hear today. As much as we admire and celebrate our old sanctuaries, old and new alike really, They are not boxes in which to stuff our gods. Sacred spaces are that in name only. They are no more sacred than any other place. Because to say that one place is sacred and another is not means that God is in one place and not in another. So if shrines and buildings and other places are not where God is, then where is God? Well, again, Paul was speaking to people who were religious in every way, he says, which means that they enjoyed a lot of religious freedom. Now, I know us Americans like to think that we have cornered the market on religious freedom. We really haven't. Hypocritically, we only like religious freedom when it applies to us, right? But in the Roman Empire, there was a noticeable plurality of beliefs and practices, religiously speaking. They had what we might call a buffet approach to religion. Just taste a little bit of everything and you'll get a good meal. And if you don't like something, you can just move on to the next dish with no judgment. Just try something else. Well, Paul, of course, was a little more specific and particular when it came to religion. As I said, he was a Pharisee who had converted to Christianity, a specific religion, and a religion that did not yet enjoy a whole lot of favor in the Roman Empire. Apparently, Rome's tolerance of other faiths had not yet warmed up to Paul's faith. Christianity would go through centuries of persecution until everyone started hitting like on its Facebook page and favoring its tweets. Paul acknowledges that these smorgasbord worshipers are trying very hard to get it right. They really are, but maybe the closest they have come to getting it right is this one little altar he found in the city, which was inscribed to an unknown God. Paul knew that God and God's whereabouts is cloaked in mystery. We certainly can't fashion an image of God with our hands, nor can we build shrines or build buildings that do this God justice. In other words, God cannot be found exclusively in anything. Try as you may, you can't make it happen. So where is God then? Or is that even the right question? Maybe it's the wrong question. Maybe the right question is, where are we? Paul had an answer. Citing the Greek poet Aratus, Paul says, in God, we live and move and have our being. Where are we? We are in God. Think about that. God doesn't live and move and have being in us. We live and move and have being in God. It's a little different approach, is it not? The question is not where is God, the question is where are we in relation to God? You know, people like to say God is in their hearts or Jesus is in their hearts. The truth is we are in God's heart. Now, because our congregation will begin worshiping in a new place next week, I'd like to focus on just part of that phrase that Paul quotes from the poet Aratus. The word move. I want to focus on the word move. Almost, I think it's ironic that our money says, in God we trust, right? I like to say, in God we move. In God we move. The most poignant stories in the Bible are stories of people who are on the move with God, in God. First there was Jacob, who was renamed later to be Israel. He was called a wandering Aramaean because he led his family to Egypt during a time of famine. God was with him and his family on their move. Generations later, the Israelites became enslaved in Egypt, oppressively tied to Pharaoh's buildings. Moses helped them to escape, and he led them on this long wandering through the wilderness. God was with them on the journey in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And centuries later, the descendants of Israel were once again captive to another people, the Babylonians. And after they were finally released from this exile, many of them made the long, dangerous trek back to Jerusalem. God was with them on their move. And that day, the voice of the prophet Isaiah cried out, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God." God is envisioned as a traveling God, a God on a journey. God accompanied the Israelites on their way back home only to discover that their sacred building, the temple, had been destroyed. And so they built another one. The New Testament is also a story about people on the go. The followers of John the Baptist and then Jesus rejected the first century temple as a den of robbers. And so after Jesus' death, they scattered throughout the region, planting and building new places of worship. And God was always with them because, as Paul said, in God we live and we move and we have our being. In God we move. There's some reporters here today. If I were a reporter sharing a story about the history of this congregation, St. John United Church of Christ, the headline would be, "In God we move." Soon we will be inhabiting a rather unpretentious building, the Mac building, the fourth building in our history, hopefully not the last. To keep with this on-the-go theme, maybe we need to think of this as God giving us the keys to a new car. Did I ever tell you about my favorite car that I owned? It was a 1975 white Monte Carlo with red pinstripes and red interior. It was ostensibly a chick magnet, although it never had an opportunity to live up to its promise. And if I remember correctly, it was my third car. The first two didn't fare so well due to teenage irresponsibility. We'll put it that way. The summer before I entered college, I managed to buy this dream car, and I thought it would be a car that would last a long, long time. It would be a car that would define me, right? In fact, a few months ago, I ran into a cousin back home in West Texas that I hadn't seen in a long time, since those days. And he said, "I sure do miss that white Monte Carlo." I said, "I bet you do." That's how he remembered me. Unfortunately, I only had that car for a short while when on the first day of college, my first day of my college career in the fall of 1978, I drove through the intersection entering into the campus on my way to school, and a large pickup truck ran a red light and plowed into my left front side, totaling my 1975 white Monte Carlo with red pinstripes and red interior. Because this happened before seat belts were mandatory, I bounced around that car like a ping pong ball, and I sustained a concussion. So suffice it to say, I missed my first day of college. I often imagine what would have happened if that car had not been destroyed. Would I still own it? Would I still drive it? Compared to today's two-door sedans, it was extremely bulky and terrible on gas mileage. It would not be very efficient today, although it would be nice, I suppose, to take it to a few classic car shows, right? But I like to compare this building to that 1975 Monte Carlo. God is now giving us the keys to a new car because the old car, well, it still looks good on the outside, but it doesn't run as efficiently as it once did. It breaks down all the time. Its tires are worn out, and quite frankly, its large, bulky size doesn't quite suit us any longer. It doesn't quite have the get up and go that it used to, right? By the way, this sermon would have worked a lot better if Giant Eagle had gone through with the purchase of this property and built a get-go as they had planned. So now we get to drive a new car. It's not as fancy, but it's more efficient. It gets better gas mileage. It has more get up and go. But that doesn't mean that we won't miss the old car. The old car will continue to be the one that defined us for a long time to come. In God, we move. That is and always has been our modus operandi. It's how we roll. So let's fasten our seatbelts and get ready for the ride of our lives. Amen.